A sprint planning agenda. Now, as we come into the sprint planning event proper, I like to break up the conversations. We know that in sprint planning, there are three topics of conversation that need to be carried out. There's the what topic, the associated why topic, and then there's the how topic. I prefer to reserve the first portion of sprint planning for the what and the why topic. I believe this allows the product owner to focus on the things that they think are most important. And then when that discussion is over, they can allow the developers to continue on with the how discussion. So this first portion regarding the what and the why, this is typically led by the product owner. The product owner comes ready to explain not only what they're looking for, but the bigger picture. I think it's helpful that for every sprint planning session, the product owner begins by explaining their vision and more specifically, the current product goal that the team is focusing on. They might even be talking about not just the next sprint, but what they see in the coming sprints. Are there any release plan expectations? As the product owner explains the different product backlog items that they'd like to see delivered this sprint, we would expect that they would be able to provide more detail on the higher priority items. It's possible they can get into lower priority items where there might be less detail, and we still have some room in sprint planning to discuss some of that needed detail if necessary, of course. Once the product owner has explained and the developers have asked their questions, because remember, this is a what and why conversation. It's time for the developers to assess what's their capacity for the coming sprint. What's their realistic ability to contribute? It would be wonderful if our developers can spend 8 hours of every business day working on our product backlog, but we know that that's not practically true. There are other things they have to tend to, maybe even some personal things. Then I like to ask our developers, which product backlog items do you think could fit into the coming sprint? This is a high level estimate. It's a first pass understanding. It's not a commitment. It's really just meant to help the product owner understand the developer's perspective on what's being asked of them. About this time, it's probably a reasonable idea to take a breath, maybe even take a little break. Because when we come back and start up again, the developers are going to take over with the how portion of sprint planning. Now, I would like my product owner to remain available, of course, because the developers might have questions as they're going through this how planning discussion. But by separating the what and the why from the how, it allows the product owner potentially to sit back a little bit while the developers are discussing technical issues that may not require the product owner's involvement. Product owner's still available, but maybe they're checking their email, for example, or refining the product backlog for the next sprint. They may not have to be part of an intimate, detailed discussion with the developers on how. They could, but they might not need to be. So developers now have their conversation, taking the selected product backlog items and decomposing them into smaller tasks. The general recommendation is each small sprint backlog task should be a day of effort or less. And the primary reason for that recommendation is for risk mitigation. If you have larger tasks, they could be recorded as part of the plan, but keep in mind that larger tasks carry with them a greater amount of risk of encountering something unknown. And the larger the task, of course, within a short sprint, the greater the risk that something could not go as planned. Now, as part of this decomposition, there are discussions about design, about dependencies, synergies, opportunities to work together, knowledge transfer opportunities. Teams that have the required specialized skills to get the job done can typically figure out what a plan would look like. Sometimes there's a required skill that the team is in short supply of. That could overload one of the team members. So our selected product backlog items will be influenced by the skills that we have present on the team. We make note of that because as the team continues to grow, we might want to consider team composition, again, cross-training, any type of knowledge improvement so that we have fewer of those types of technical skill bottlenecks. Now, once the developers have put together their decomposed plan, they can reassess. They know what the product owners asked for. They understand what a decomposed picture looks like. They understand their capacity. They understand the product backlog items that they thought they might be able to fit into this sprint. And now they're putting it all together to see, does that look realistic? Or do we have to make some adjustments? And then we have a final discussion where all of us evaluate what would be a good sprint goal for this sprint. Now, the product owner could have come to sprint planning with a sprint goal in mind, but the sprint goal is the work of the entire Scrum team, and there has to be agreement upon that. The best place to do that is after we've had a chance to evaluate all of the work. I like to have some form of confirmation across our developers. I don't need to have every developer explain all the work during the sprint, but what are you going to start on the first day of work, the first day of execution, to make sure we're not bumping into each other, to make sure that we're starting off on the right foot. And then the very last thing that I like to do, celebrate. An old friend of mine said, celebrate often and don't wait to celebrate. Well, what are we celebrating? We're celebrating the launch of another sprint together where we were able to spend maybe hours working together on a plan. Well, how many hours? We know that the Scrum Guide tells us that sprint planning should not last more than 8 hours, regardless of the sprint length. And we know that the maximum sprint length is 1 month. So it's reasonable to assume that if you had a shorter sprint length of, say, maybe 2 weeks, that it would also be reasonable to have a shorter sprint planning discussion. But 8 hours is the maximum. When we break up the conversations to the what and the why, separate from the how, I like to split sprint planning down the middle. Let's take the first portion of sprint planning. Maybe it's 4 hours if it's a month-long sprint. Discuss the what and the why, and then the remaining 4 hours for the how. I hope you find this helpful. Make your own agendas. This is just from my own personal experience where I have found successful working across hundreds of teams, but it doesn't mean it's the only right way.